She walked into that auction with $847 in her pocket, surrounded by men who'd been farming this land since before she was born, and she bid on the one thing nobody else wanted: 300 turkey poults, sickly, undersized, purchased in the dead heat of June when even experienced hands knew better. "That girl just threw her life away," someone muttered loud enough for her to hear. She heard it. She kept walking. What happened next on that mountain would force an entire county to question everything they thought they knew about failure, forgotten wisdom, and the stubborn silence of someone who simply refused to lose. If this story grips you from the very first minute, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The auction yard smelled the way it always smelled in early summer: diesel, manure, anxiety, and coffee that had been sitting in a percolator since 5 in the morning. Folding tables ran the length of the gravel lot behind Hendrick's Feed and Supply, and by 8 o'clock every one of them had a man leaning against it with his arms crossed, the way men in Ashridge County crossed their arms when they wanted to look like they weren't interested in something but absolutely were. Rowan Mercer stood at the edge of the lot near the livestock pens, wearing her grandmother's old work boots, a half size too big, and a canvas jacket with a tear along the left shoulder seam she hadn't gotten around to sewing. She had a paper cup of that terrible coffee in one hand and a numbered bid card in the other, and she was reading the hand-lettered sign zip-tied to the pen in front of her. Lot 47, approx. 300 bronze turkey poults, 3 weeks old. Seller, motivated, motivated. That was the word they used when something was so far gone that the seller would take almost anything to make it someone else's problem. She already knew what she was looking at. She'd done her research. The poults had come from a commercial operation 2 counties over that had shut down abruptly. Some kind of feed contract dispute. The details weren't entirely clear. The birds had been in transit twice, handled roughly, and the heat over the past 2 weeks had been the kind of heat that turned ordinary problems into catastrophic ones. The mortality rate in the pen had already been around 12%, according to the sheet she'd requested from the auction coordinator. The remaining birds were thin, some of them panting even in the morning air, their small heads bobbing with a kind of exhausted persistence that was almost hard to watch. 3 men had already stopped near the pen, looked at the sign, looked at the birds, and walked away without breaking stride. Rowan didn't walk away. She crouched down against the wire fencing and looked at them for a long time. "You're not seriously thinking about bidding on those?" She didn't turn around immediately. She knew the voice. Dale Pritchard, 53 years old, 4th-generation turkey farmer, president of the Ashridge County Poultry Growers Association, 2 years running. He was the kind of man who stated things that were technically questions. "Morning, Dale," she said. "I asked you a question." She stood up then, turned to face him. He was a big man, broad across the chest, with a face weathered into permanent skepticism. He'd known her family her whole life, had bought feed alongside her grandfather for 20 years, and probably thought that gave him a certain authority over the situation. "I'm thinking about it," she said. He looked at the pen, then back at her, with the expression of someone watching a person walk toward an open manhole. "Those birds are going to be dead by July 4th, he said. "Half of them look like they're already heading that direction. Heat stress, probably some respiratory issues on top of it. Whoever takes that lot is going to spend 2 months nursing sick animals and end up with nothing to show for it." "Maybe." "Not maybe. That's what's going to happen." He said it with the flat certainty of someone who'd seen it before, which he probably had. "You just got back here. You haven't run a commercial flock since, well, have you ever run a commercial flock?" "No." "Then why in God's name would you start with those?" She didn't have a clean answer to that, not one that would satisfy a man like Dale Pritchard. The real answer was complicated, and it involved a stone building at the back of her grandmother's property that she'd found 3 weeks ago under 20 years of overgrown blackberry cane. It involved a set of journals she'd been reading by headlamp at 2 in the morning. It involved a feeling which she understood would carry exactly 0 weight in this conversation. "I'll take my chances," she said. Dale shook his head slowly, the way people do when they've decided someone is beyond help. "Your grandmother know you're planning to do this?" "She knows I'm at the auction." "That's not what I asked." "No," Rowan said. "It's not." He walked away. She turned back to the pen. Rowan had come back to Ash Ridge in April, 6 weeks after her grandmother's first fall. Margaret Mercer, Nana Mag to everyone who knew her, though she didn't love the nickname, was 78 years old and had been running the family's 140-acre mountain property alone for 11 years, since Rowan's grandfather passed. She'd been managing it the way a person manages something they refuse to let go of, despite knowing they probably should, stubbornly, imperfectly, with a mule-headedness that her doctor described diplomatically as an independent spirit. The fall had been in the kitchen, nothing broken, just bruised, and more frightening than physically serious. But the call Rowan received at 6:30 in the morning in her apartment in Asheville, where she'd been working as an assistant project manager for a small construction company and wondering if she was in the right life, had been one of those calls that clarifies things quickly. She'd driven the 3 hours that same day. She'd called her supervisor from the road. She hadn't gone back. The farm was called Mercer Ridge, though nobody outside the family used that name anymore. It sat at roughly 3,100 feet elevation on the western face of Bluestone Mountain, accessed by a gravel road that required a truck and a willingness to accept some cosmetic damage to your undercarriage. The farmhouse was old but solid, fieldstone foundation, wide pine floors, a kitchen with a wood stove that still worked if you knew how to work it. Her grandmother had heat, running water, and an internet connection that mostly functioned, which was more than some places at that elevation. The land was rougher. Years of reduced management had let the lower pastures go to thistle and fescue. The upper fields, where her grandfather had once kept a respectable beef operation, had grown up in sumac and locust saplings. The fence lines needed work, the barn needed new roofing on the east side, and the access road had a washout near the third switchback that turned dangerous in heavy rain. Rowan had spent April and most of May doing triage. She was competent with her hands. She'd worked construction, she'd grown up on this land, and she had the particular physical efficiency of someone who doesn't waste motion. She worked long days, slept hard, and spent her evenings eating soup at the kitchen table with her grandmother, listening to her talk about the farm the way it used to be. That was how she'd learned about the curing house. "Your great-grandfather built it," Margaret said one evening, matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. "Before the war, back when we still did the turkeys." "You kept turkeys here?" "3 generations, before your grandfather switched to beef." She'd paused, looked out the window at the dark hillside. "He thought beef was more practical, and it was, probably, but the turkeys were something special." "What kind of turkeys?" "Heritage birds. Narragansetts, mostly. Some bronzes. Kept them on pasture the old way, let them forage." She'd shaken her head at something Rowan couldn't quite read. "And we cured the meat, hung it in the stone house up on the north side of the property. There was a process. Your great-great-grandmother brought it over from her family's farm in Pennsylvania. It took time, but the flavor—" She'd stopped, waved her hand. "You can't describe it to someone who hasn't tasted it. You just can't." Rowan had gone looking for the curing house the next morning. It took her 3 days to find it. The structure was set into the hillside about a quarter-mile north of the barn, built from flat limestone mortared with clay, roofed in cedar shingles that had mostly survived under the shelter of 2 enormous white oaks that had grown up around it. The blackberry cane was so thick she'd had to come back with loppers and a brush hook, and the door, a heavy oak plank on iron hardware, had swollen in its frame and required a pry bar and some patience. But when it finally opened, the interior was dry, cool, even in the warming days of May. The stone walls had accumulated a thin, dark film of the kind of complex mold that old smokehouses and curing rooms develop over decades. Not rot, but something more specific, something the old books on fermentation and aging called a house culture. The wooden rails where meat would have hung were intact. A stone shelf along the back wall held a collection of stoneware crocks, empty but intact. And in a tin box on that shelf, wrapped in oilcloth and completely dry, she'd found the journals. About then, 4 of them, filled with a cramped, meticulous hand. Her great-great-grandmother, a woman named Elva, who had apparently believed in recording everything. Temperatures, weights, humidity estimates, feed compositions, slaughter dates, cure times, salt ratios. There were sketches of the pasture rotation system. There were notes on forage identification, which wild plants the birds sought out, which they avoided, what effect different foraging seemed to have on meat quality. There were accounts of drought years and wet years and the adjustments made to compensate. Reading them had felt to Rowan like someone had pulled back a curtain she hadn't known was there. She'd stayed up until 3 in the morning reading, and the next morning had driven to the county library in town, where she'd spent 4 hours on the computer researching heritage turkeys, specialty meat markets, and the small but apparently growing world of premium poultry operations. The numbers were not simple. The numbers were also, if she was reading them right, potentially significant. Premium heritage turkey, properly aged, was selling for prices that made her standard agricultural assumptions look naive. There were restaurants in Asheville, in Charlotte, in Knoxville that were actively looking for product they couldn't find. There were chefs writing about it in terms that would have seemed absurd applied to a turkey 3 years ago. But the time investment was enormous. The risk was real. The knowledge required was almost entirely dead. She had a set of 100-year-old journals and a library, and that was most of what she had. She'd started calling it a plan, in her head, even when it still felt more like a wish. Lot 47 opened at $180. There was exactly one other bidder, a man named Cutler from over near Waynesboro, who ran a small operation and probably figured he might save a few of them. He went to $220 without much enthusiasm. Rowan bid $260. Cutler looked at her the way you look at someone you're not sure is serious. He bid $280. She went to $320. He dropped out. He actually shrugged while doing it, which she would remember later. She paid $347 for the lot, which left her with exactly $500 in her operating account and a truck bed full of problems she'd promised herself she could solve. The drive back up the mountain took 40 minutes. The Polts rode in ventilated crates in the bed, and she drove slowly, avoiding the worst of the road's washboard sections, listening to the soft sounds they made. That anxious, persistent chirping that turkey poults do when they're stressed but not yet defeated. Her phone rang when she was halfway up. She answered it through the truck's speaker. "Tell me you didn't," her grandmother said. "I got them for $320. A long silence. "Dale Pritchard called here." "Of course he did. He said you bought 300 sick turkeys on your last $500. He's exaggerating about the 500. I still have... Never mind." She slowed for the washout. "Nana, I need you to trust me on this." "I trust you." A pause. "I didn't say I wasn't worried." "I know. How many do you think will survive?" Rowan looked at the road ahead. She thought about the journals she'd been reading. She thought about what Elva had written during the drought year of 1936, when she'd lost a third of her flock and rebuilt from the remainder without, apparently, considering giving up. "Enough," she said. She set up the brooding area in the barn's east wing, where she'd repaired the roof and installed additional ventilation during her first weeks on the farm. The setup was improvised. Heat lamps on adjustable chains, thermometers at bird level, waterers she'd rigged from 5-gallon buckets and horizontal nipple fittings. Nothing fancy. Nothing that didn't need to be there. She lost 9 birds in the first 3 days. She'd expected worse, honestly. She tracked every loss, documented the symptoms, and adjusted. Electrolytes in the water, reduced stocking density, adjusted the lamp height to manage temperature more precisely. She was doing 4 checks a day, 5 in the morning, noon, 5 in the evening, 10 at night. She was sleeping in 6-hour chunks and developing a relationship with the alarm on her phone that she would not have called healthy. By the end of the second week, the mortality had slowed. The birds that were going to die from the initial stress mostly had. The ones that remained had a certain quality to their movement, a liveliness, a pecking curiosity, that she'd read about in the journals and recognized with something close to relief. The ones that survive hardship early tend to be the stronger foundation, Elva had written. This is not sentimentality. It is simple observation repeated across many seasons. Rowan had written that line on a piece of tape and stuck it to the wall above the brooder. The gossip in town had already started. She heard it second and third hand, filtered through her grandmother's careful recounting of conversations at the pharmacy and the hardware store. Dale Pritchard had been vocal. Some of the younger farmers thought it was funny. The city girl coming back to play farmer with a bunch of dying birds. There was apparently a running joke at the feed store that had something to do with a turkey dinner that never materialized. She heard it, she noted it, and then she went back to checking her thermometers. Because here was the thing nobody in Ashridge knew yet, the thing she was holding close while they made their jokes. She wasn't raising turkeys for the commodity market. She wasn't chasing the price per pound that every conventional farmer in the county was chasing. What she was building, slowly, carefully, with a set of 100-year-old instructions and a stone building full of potential, was something they didn't have a price for yet. But they would. She'd make sure of that. The Polts grew through June, testing her patience, her bank account, and every assumption she'd brought back from the city about how long things should take and how clearly progress should look. It rarely looked clear. Most days it just looked like work. Moving birds, monitoring water, patching fencing, hauling feed, losing sleep. On a Thursday in late June, she was out at dusk moving the portable shelters she'd built from salvaged lumber and wire, light enough to drag by hand, heavy enough to withstand the wind that came off the mountain in the evenings. The birds were moving with them, already learning the pattern after only a week of rotation, following the shelters with a kind of unglamorous purpose that she was starting to find genuinely satisfying to watch. Dale Pritchard's truck came up the access road, which surprised her. He didn't get out right away. He sat for a minute, engine running, watching her work. Then he rolled down the window. "How many you got left?" he called. She looked up, kept moving the next section of shelter. 273. A pause. "That's better than I figured." She didn't say anything. He leaned an arm out the window. The evening light was coming sideways across the mountain, making everything look a little more significant than it probably was. "What are you planning to do with them, exactly? You going to try to sell to the processing plant over in Shelton?" "No." "Then where?" "I don't have it fully worked out yet," she said, which was partly true. She had it worked out enough. She just wasn't ready to explain it to Dale Pritchard on a Thursday evening in late June. He nodded slowly. She could tell he was deciding whether to push it. He decided not to. "You're going to need more feed in about 2 weeks," he said instead. "I've got a source for non-GMO grain mix over near Marion, better than what Hendricks stocks." She stopped, looked at him. "Why are you telling me that?" He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "Your grandfather was a good man," he said finally, "and I'm probably not going to stop thinking you've lost your mind, but..." He shrugged, and it was a different kind of shrug than Cutler's at the auction. Less dismissive, more like resignation. "I thought you should know about the grain." He rolled up the window and turned the truck around. Rowan watched him go. Then she turned back to her birds in the long golden light on a mountain that most people had written off as already finished. She dragged the next shelter into position. The turkeys followed. The grain tip from Dale Pritchard turned out to be legitimate, which annoyed her slightly because it would have been easier to dismiss him entirely. The source near Marion was a small family mill run by a man named Gerald Foss, who'd been grinding non-GMO feed blends for 20 years and had the deeply particular personality of someone who had spent 2 decades being right about something before anyone else caught on. He was 70, lean, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from fence post. He walked Rowan through his operation without being asked, explaining the protein ratios in his turkey grower formula with the methodical patience of a man who'd had to justify himself too many times to rush through it now. "Most commercial operations want cheap and consistent," he told her, running a handful of grain through his fingers over a sample bin. "They don't want quality, they want predictability. Different thing entirely." "I need quality," she said. He looked at her the way people look at someone when they're deciding whether to take them seriously. "What are you doing with them?" She told him, the broad version, not the details about the journals, not the curing house, just the heritage approach, the pasture rotation, the premium market angle. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your birds on pasture already?" "Transitioning them now. They'll be fully out by mid-July." What forage do you have up there? Mixed. Some clover coming in where I've been clearing, wild berries on the upper edges. Lot of insects, said U. The rotation's been churning up the soil enough that the bug population is significant. Gerald Foss nodded slowly, still turning grain over in his palm. You want my turkey grower formula, but cut the corn ratio by about 12% and bring up the sunflower meal. The birds foraging that kind of mix, they don't need as much energy from the grain. You overload them on corn, it flattens the flavor. Commercial operations don't care. But if you're doing what you say you're doing, he closed his fist around the grain and looked at her directly. You care. I care, she said. She drove home with the first bulk order loaded in the bed of the truck, and she felt for the first time since she'd bid on those poults in June, like she might have found one person in the county who understood what she was trying to do. That was enough to matter. One person. She wasn't greedy about it. July arrived the way summers arrive in the southern Appalachians, not gradually, but like a door slamming open. The temperature broke 100 degrees on July 5th, which was unusual even for Ash Ridge, and it held there for 11 consecutive days. The kind of heat that warps barnwood and makes the air above the gravel roads shimmer and turns every living thing on the mountain into a problem to be managed, rather than a creature simply going about its life. Rowan had been preparing for heat stress since she'd read Elva's account of the summer of 1930, when temperatures had pushed the same numbers and the record had been unambiguous. The birds that had access to shade and cool water at all hours survived. The birds that did not, did not. No amount of other management compensates for the basics in extreme heat. Remember this every year, regardless of what the weather was the year before. She'd built shade structures over each of the rotational paddocks. Simple frames covered in aluminum-coated shade cloth, ugly as anything, but functional. She'd moved the water stations to 3 per paddock instead of 1, and she'd started adding apple cider vinegar to the water in small quantities, which she'd found referenced in 2 separate entries in the journals as a respiratory aid during hot weather. She had no clinical evidence for it. She had Elva's handwriting and a reasonable willingness to try things that cost almost nothing. She still lost birds. 7 in 3 days during the worst stretch, when the temperature hit 104 and the humidity came up simultaneously and the air on the mountain felt like something solid pressing down. She found them in the mornings, still small, already cooling by the time she made her 5 a.m. round. She recorded each one in the notebook she'd started keeping in the same format as the journals because she'd decided early that if this was going to work, she needed her own record to pass down eventually, and that meant being honest about the losses as much as the gains. 261 birds. She did the math every morning before she did anything else. Margaret watched all of this from the farmhouse with the careful attention of someone who wants to help, but has learned, across 7+ decades of living, when help is not what's needed. She kept the farmhouse, managed the kitchen garden, made meals that appeared on the table at regular intervals as though conjured by a separate and more dependable operation. She didn't ask about the numbers. She knew Rowan would tell her when she wanted to talk about them. What she did do was pull down, from the back of the highest shelf in the bedroom closet, a cardboard box that had been sitting there since before Rowan was born. She brought it to the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in mid-July. "These were your great-grandmother's," she said. "Ruth's, not Elva's. She's the one who worked alongside Elva the longest. These are her notes on the curing." Rowan opened the box. Inside were 3 composition notebooks, newer than the tin box journals, maybe 1950s era, and a collection of loose papers covered in a rounder, less disciplined hand than Elva's. Where Elva had been precise and technical, Ruth had been more conversational, almost chatty, full of observations that veered between practical information and something closer to personal essay. There was a passage about the smell of the curing house in October that made Rowan set the notebook down for a moment, because it was written with such particular physical specificity that it felt almost intrusive to read, like walking into a room where someone was still present. "The smell is not like anything else," Ruth had written, "not like smoke, not like plain salt meat, not like the smell of a regular cold cellar. It is something built up over years inside those stones, a kind of conversation the old wood and the stone and the air have been having without us. When you open the door in the first week of October, It hits you, and you understand immediately why the rest of the year's work was worth it. Rowan read that passage twice. Then she took the notebooks to the curing house and spent the afternoon sitting on the stone floor with them, cross-referencing against Elva's technical notes, building in her head what was beginning to feel less like a theory and more like a plan with actual dimensions. The curing process was complex, not in an intimidating way, but in the way that anything is complex when the timing and the conditions are genuinely specific. The birds needed to be processed at the right age. The weight at slaughter mattered. The salt cure had to be applied at a precise ratio and rested at a controlled temperature. Then there was a dry aging phase that used the curing house's unique internal environment, its particular temperature range, the natural humidity control provided by the stone and the surrounding hillside, and that accumulated culture in the wood and walls that modern food science would likely have a precise explanation for, but that Elva had simply called the house knowing what it's doing. The total process from slaughter to finished product was between 4 and 7 weeks, depending on the bird's size. That timeline meant she needed to make decisions about her harvest schedule now, in July, for something that wouldn't be ready until mid to late November at the earliest. She was running a 4-month bet with no safety net visible anywhere. The heat broke on the 12th day. She woke to a morning that was 20 degrees cooler than the day before, with a low cloud sitting on the top of the mountain and the smell of wet stone everywhere, and she walked out to check the birds and found them moving differently, more energetically, ranging further in the paddock, doing the particular head-bobbing investigation of grass and ground that indicated birds that were not, at the moment, in any kind of distress. 254 surviving. She wrote it down. It was in her own quiet accounting a win. She drove to town that afternoon for supplies, and the feed store was occupied, as it often was on weekday afternoons, by a loose assembly of farmers who were either buying something or waiting for a reason to stop buying something and start talking. She recognized most of them. Carl Weems, who ran a large conventional turkey operation on the flat land east of town. Brothers named Shook, she couldn't remember their first names, who did contract broiler production. A younger man she didn't know who was apparently interning with the county extension office. The conversation, which had been about the heat and soybeans and a zoning dispute on the south side of the county, shifted when she walked in, the way conversations do when the subject of them enters the room. It wasn't subtle. That was the thing about Ash Ridge. People here were not especially practiced at subtlety when they had already decided to have a position about something. "Rowan," Carl Weems said, which wasn't a greeting so much as an announcement. "How's the turkey project going?" "Fine," she said. She picked up a bag of screws from the hardware section at the back. "I heard you lost some in the heat last week." Word traveled at a speed in this county that continually surprised her, even though it shouldn't have anymore. "Some," she confirmed. "How many you got left?" "Enough." Carl had the particular quality of a man who asks questions he already believes he knows the answers to. You know the processing plant in Shelton's going to want to see some volume if you're going to make it worth their while. "What are you working with? You started with 300? "I'm not using the Shelton plant," she said. That got a reaction. Not dramatic, but noticeable. A slight recalibration in the room, the way people shift when something doesn't land where they expected. "Where are you planning to process then?" "On the farm." She brought her items to the register. "On the farm," Carl repeated, with a tone that managed to be both neutral and entirely skeptical. "You're going to do your own processing. You got the setup for that?" "I'm building it." One of the Shook brothers made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but functioned as one. The extension office kids stared at the floor with the careful discomfort of someone who was new to the dynamic and hadn't yet decided where his loyalties should be. "You're going to process, what, 250 birds yourself?" Carl said. "Not all at once." "What's your market?" She paid for her items, picked up the bag. "I'm still working on that part," she said, which was the truest and least satisfying answer she could give. She drove home with their skepticism sitting somewhere in her chest, uncomfortable but not debilitating. It was the same feeling she'd had in the first week with the Polts. Not doubt exactly, but the particular weight of doing something alone that everyone around you has decided is wrong. You could get used to it, she'd found. It didn't become pleasant, but you could learn to carry it without letting it slow you down. She stopped at the end of the access road before turning up the mountain and sat for a moment with the engine idling. Through the windshield, she could see the ridge, still shrouded in the lower remnants of the morning's cloud. The farm was up there somewhere, invisible from here. Her grandmother in the farmhouse, the birds spread across the paddocks, the stone curing house waiting with its century of accumulated knowledge locked inside the walls. She put the truck in gear. August came in behind July without much change in the pressure from either the weather or the people in town, though the nature of it shifted slightly. The heat became more ordinary, still punishing some days, but without that record-breaking edge that had made July feel like a sustained emergency. The birds grew in the way that heritage breeds grow, which is to say slower and more irregularly than any commercial operation would tolerate, but with a quality of muscle development and feather density that she was beginning to recognize as the visual language of what the journals described. Rowan had found a photograph tucked in the back of Ruth's second notebook, black and white, badly faded, of a line of finished bronze turkeys hanging in the curing house, and she had studied that photograph until she could see the specific body composition she was working toward. The predator pressure started in August. She'd been expecting it, had set up a perimeter of electric fencing around the main paddock areas in June, but the particular predator she dealt with first was one she hadn't fully planned for. Not coyote, not fox, though both were present on the mountain. A bear, a single black bear, young by the look of its track, had found the lowest paddock sometime during the third week of August, and had taken 3 birds before she heard the commotion at 2 a.m. and came out with a flashlight and a considerable amount of noise that sent it back into the tree line. She stood in the paddock with her flashlight scanning the dark edges of the tree line for 20 minutes after it left, her heart doing something irregular in her chest, and then she went and looked at what it had left and made herself document it in the notebook before she went back inside. 2:51. She reinforced the lower fence with a second hot wire the following day and moved the birds from the lowest paddock to one higher up the slope, and she lost half a night's sleep for the next week listening for the particular silence that descends when a large predator enters a space where animals are. She heard it once more, that specific quiet, different from ordinary night quiet, and she went out and banged pots together at the edge of the tree line, and it didn't come back after that, at least not close enough to reach the birds again. She mentioned it to Dale Pritchard when he came by the following week with a sample bag of mineral supplement he thought might be worth her trying. He'd been doing that, stopping by with small things, information, samples, the occasional observation delivered as though he hadn't driven 20 minutes out of his way to deliver it. She'd stopped being surprised by it and started just noting that it happened. "Bear's gonna come back," he said, looking at the fence reinforcement. "Probably. You thought about livestock guardian dogs." "I've thought about it. They're expensive to get started. My neighbor's daughter's got a pair of Pyrenees she's trying to place. Working dogs, not pets. She moved into town, can't keep them." He pulled out his phone, looked for a number she hadn't expected him to have ready. "I can give you her contact." She took the contact. She called that evening. By the end of the following week, there were 2 large white dogs on Mercer Ridge who took to the flock with the focused, serious commitment of animals who understood their purpose more clearly than most people understand theirs. She named them both, despite knowing it was probably a mistake to name working dogs, and then decided it wasn't a mistake, because caring about them didn't have to compromise their effectiveness. The gossip in town had evolved. She knew because her grandmother reported it with the careful neutrality of someone passing along information without editorializing, though Margaret Mercer had plenty of opinions and chose when to deploy them. The early mockery, the jokes about the dying birds and the bankruptcy waiting to happen, had developed a kind of added dimension. People were now arguing about whether she might actually know what she was doing, and this argument apparently produced more heat than the original consensus had, because disagreement in a small county is more interesting than agreement. Carl Weems was, by report, still firmly in the skeptic column and had said some things at the county extension meeting that were more pointed than his usual public skepticism. Dale Pritchard had apparently said something back that stopped just short of an actual confrontation. The extension office kid, She'd learned his name was Patrick. He was 26 from somewhere outside Raleigh, had come up the mountain one afternoon on what he described as an informal visit, but was clearly an officially sanctioned one, with a clipboard and a set of questions about her management practices. She'd answered his questions. She'd also walked him through the paddock rotation, shown him the mobile shelters, let him see the birds up close. He'd been quiet for most of it, taking notes with the careful focus of someone who was encountering something they hadn't been given a category for in their training. At the end, standing by his car, he'd said, "This is actually, I've read about this approach, but I've never seen anyone actually doing it around here." "Not many people are," she said. "What's your processing plan?" He said it professionally, like it was just another item on the checklist. "On site, small batch. I'm building out the facility now." He made a note. Then he looked up and said, off the record, clearly, "For what it's worth, the birds look good. Really good, actually." She watched him drive away down the access road. Then she went back to work. The on-site processing facility was the challenge she'd been pushing toward and slightly away from since she'd decided the Shelton plant wasn't part of her plan. The regulations for on-farm poultry processing in the state allowed for up to a certain number of birds per year without requiring the full commercial processing license, which was the window she was working inside. But even the smaller exemption required specific infrastructure: a clean water supply at the site, a covered work area, proper waste disposal, equipment that met basic sanitation standards. She'd been building it in stages since June. The structure was a converted lean-to shed on the north side of the barn, which she'd insulated, lined, and plumbed with a cold water line that ran from the spring box her grandfather had installed in the 1980s. She'd bought used equipment in stages: a scalding vat from a farm auction in 2 counties over, a mechanical picker she found through an online farm equipment listing that required 3 days of repair work to get running reliably. She'd spent an afternoon on a video call with a woman in Vermont who ran a heritage poultry operation she'd found through an online forum, asking questions she wasn't too proud to ask, and receiving answers that were frank and practical and occasionally alarming. "Your first processing day is going to be a disaster," the Vermont woman, whose name was Karen, had told her. "Okay," Rowan had said. "Not maybe a disaster. It's going to be a disaster. You're going to be slower than you expect, something's going to break down, and you're going to be exhausted by noon. That's just what happens. The question is whether you keep going after noon." "I'll keep going." "Good." A pause. "And don't try to do it alone. You need at least one other person on a processing line who knows what they're doing, at minimum." She'd thought about who that person was going to be for 2 weeks before she'd decided on someone she hadn't expected to ask. Patrick from the extension office had come back up the mountain twice since his initial visit. Once officially, once less so, in the early evening on a Saturday when he'd arrived with a 6-pack of decent beer and an admission that he'd been thinking about her operation and had some questions that weren't on his clipboard. She liked him reasonably well. He was honest in the specific way that people are when they're smart enough to know they don't know everything yet, which she found more useful than false confidence. She'd asked him if he'd ever been part of a poultry processing operation. "My uncle had chickens," he said carefully. "Growing up." "That's not quite what I need." "No," he agreed, "but I learned fast." She'd also called Dale Pritchard, which had cost her something, though she wouldn't have been able to explain exactly what. "I need help for the first processing run," she'd said, on the phone, standing in the kitchen with her grandmother pretending to do something at the counter. A pause on the other end of the line. Then, "When?" "October, probably 2nd or 3rd week." "How many birds the first run?" 20, maybe 25. Small enough to figure out what I'm doing before I commit to the rest of the flock." Another pause. "You got a scalder?" "Yes." "You got a picker working right?" "It runs. I'm still not sure about the consistency." "The pickers are always a problem," he said, with the weary certainty of someone who had dealt with many pickers. "All right, I'll be there. 6 o'clock. 6 in the morning? You want to be done before it gets hot?" "Yes, 6 in the morning." She'd hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Her grandmother hadn't turned around from the counter. "Dale Pritchard's coming up to help you?" "First processing day? Yes." Margaret set down what she was holding. She turned around then, and her face had an expression that Rowan didn't see on it often. Something complicated, between satisfaction and something older. "He helped your grandfather with the cattle for years," she said. "Before things got—" She stopped, didn't finish the sentence. "He's a good man," she said instead. "He just gets set in his way of seeing things." "He's coming around," Rowan said. "He is." Margaret picked up what she'd set down. "People usually do, eventually. The problem is, eventually takes forever." September arrived, and with it the change in the birds that Rowan had been watching for. The bronze turkeys were developing the deep chest and wide back that the journals described, and their coloring had come in with the particular iridescence that gave the breed its name, green and copper and black that shifted depending on the angle of the light, so that a flock of them moving across a hillside in the September morning looked, briefly, like something considerably more remarkable than livestock. She took a photograph one morning and then felt slightly embarrassed about having done it, but she didn't delete it. The birds were somewhere between 22 and 24 weeks, and the largest of the toms were approaching 18 pounds. She was doing weight checks twice a week now, recording everything, trying to calibrate her harvest plan against what the journal specified for ideal processing weight and condition. There was a night in late September when the first real cold came down off the mountain. Actual autumn cold, not just the absence of summer heat. And she sat on the porch after dinner with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, watching the dark field below the barn where the birds were settled for the night, with the dogs moving their slow perimeter patrol around the edges. She thought about the math. She thought about the curing house and the salt ratios and the timing. She thought about the restaurant in Asheville she'd been in contact with, a chef named Dominique Farrow, who ran a farm-to-table operation in the River Arts District and had answered her email with 3 specific questions and a statement that she would, if Rowan could deliver a sample worth evaluating, give it a fair assessment. Fair assessment. It was the most she could ask for. She thought about what fair assessment meant when you'd spent 6 months building something on the foundation of 100-year-old notebooks and a stone building and a bet that the people around you had already decided was wrong. She thought about Elva, who had done this without the internet, without email, without the option of calling a woman in Vermont for advice, who had done it in a drought year and written about it in a precise and unfrantic hand and kept going. She finished the cold coffee. She went inside. October was 3 days away. October arrived the way Rowan had needed it to, cold and clear, with frost on the lower paddocks by 5 in the morning and a light that came sideways off the ridge and made everything look like it was being seen for the first time. She was already awake when the alarm went off at 4:30. She'd been awake since 3, if she was honest, lying in the dark, running through the sequence of the day the way you do when you've been planning something so long that the planning has started to eat into the sleeping. Dale Pritchard's truck came up the access road at 5:58. She watched the headlights through the kitchen window while she finished her coffee. He wasn't alone. He'd brought a woman Rowan didn't recognize, mid-50s, compact and efficient-looking, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular no-nonsense posture of someone who has processed poultry before and has no patience for people who haven't. Her name was Barbara, and Dale introduced her without elaboration other than she knows what she's doing, which turned out to be sufficiently accurate that no further elaboration was needed. Patrick arrived 7 minutes later, slightly out of breath, with a thermos of coffee and an expression of determined usefulness. The 4 of them stood in the lean-to facility in the pre-dawn dark while Rowan ran through the sequence, scalding temperature, timing on the picker, the specific way she needed the carcasses handled before they went into the chill water, the record-keeping she needed done on every bird. She'd written it out on a laminated sheet she'd taped to the wall. She'd gone over it twice in her head while lying awake at 3 in the morning. "You've done all this before?" Barbara asked, not skeptically, just directly, the way someone asks when they need an accurate picture. "No," Rowan said, "not at this scale. I've done walkthroughs, watched videos, talked to people who have." Barbara nodded once. "All right, I'll run the picker. You stay on the chill tank and the documentation. The 2 of you," she looked at Dale and Patrick, "are on scald and hang." Nobody argued. There was something settling about having a person in the room who simply organized the situation without drama. The first bird went through at 6:22 in the morning. Karen from Vermont had been right. It was not smooth. The scalder took longer to come to temperature than Rowan had calculated, which backed up the entire sequence by 20 minutes before they'd processed a single animal. The picker jammed twice in the first hour, a problem with feather bunching on the larger toms that required stopping, clearing, and adjusting the tension on the rubber fingers, something Rowan added to her notebook in real time with cold hands, while Dale held a flashlight and didn't say anything unhelpful. Patrick dropped a bird getting it to the chill tank and had to be redirected, which he took without complaint. Barbara moved through the work with the focused, almost meditative efficiency of someone who had been doing difficult physical tasks for decades and had made peace with the fact that difficult physical tasks are mostly about not stopping. By 9 o'clock, they had a rhythm, not a good rhythm. The word good would be generous, but something functional, something that had its own cadence and could be maintained without constant crisis management. By noon, they had processed 23 birds. Rowan's back hurt in a way that would persist for 4 days. Her hands were cold from the chill tank, and she'd developed a blister on her right palm from the equipment handle that she noticed somewhere around bird 15 and decided was irrelevant. She kept her documentation going on every carcass, weight, condition notes, anything that deviated from what the journals specified as ideal. They broke for lunch at 12:30. Her grandmother had sent food down from the farmhouse in a basket without being asked: biscuits, ham, a container of soup that had somehow stayed warm. They ate standing up in the lean-to because sitting down felt like something you'd have trouble coming back from. "Your picker needs new fingers," Dale said, eating a biscuit in 2 bites, "before you do the main run." "I know. And your scald temperature's inconsistent. The thermostat on that unit is drifting." "I know that too." He looked at her. "You keep good records." "Yes." "That'll matter more than you think." He said it without sentimentality, just as a statement of fact, and moved on to the soup. Barbara left at 2, after helping break down and clean the processing area, with a handshake and the spare but genuine comment that Rowan had set things up better than she'd expected. Dale stayed another hour, helped check the final carcasses, and then stood in the yard by his truck in the afternoon light with his hands in his jacket pockets. 23 birds, he said. 23 birds, she confirmed. "What are you doing with them?" "Dry salt cure starting tomorrow, then into the curing house." He was quiet for a moment. She'd told him the general outline of the plan weeks ago, but this was the first time it was real, actual carcasses going into an actual process that nobody in the county had attempted in decades. She could see him working through something. "You really think that old building's going to do what you need it to do?" he asked. "I think the conditions are right. The temperature range is right. The house culture in the walls is still active. I've had that independently confirmed." She'd sent a swab sample to a university extension lab in July without announcing it, and the lab report had come back with a characterization of the microbial community present that would have meant nothing to most people and meant quite a lot to her. "It's going to do what it's always done. I just have to let it." Dale looked at the mountain above the barn for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "Your grandfather would have thought you were insane." "I know. He also would have been watching every day to see if it worked." He opened his truck door. "Call me if the picker dies on you. I know a man in Spruce Pine who does equipment repair." He drove down the mountain. Patrick had stayed to help with cleanup and was loading the last of the waste into the composting system she'd set up on the far side of the barn. He was quieter than usual, and she noticed it without commenting on it until they were done, and he was washing his hands at the outdoor spigot, and she came up beside him. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah." He turned off the water, dried his hands on his jeans. I write reports about operations like this. What farmers should be doing, what the sustainable models look like theoretically." He paused. "Being here, doing it, is different." "Different how?" He thought about it. "In the reports, it's all outcomes. Here it's just a lot of cold hands and things going wrong and keeping going anyway." "That's what it is," she said. "Does it bother you that it's this unglamorous?" She looked at the processing facility, the yard, the birds settling in the paddocks up the hill as the afternoon light began to angle lower. "No," she said. "The unglamorous part is the part I trust." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away. Then he picked up his thermos, said he'd be in touch, and drove back down to wherever people who wrote reports went at the end of the day. She went to prepare the salt cure. Elva's formula was precise in the way that old recipes are precise when they've been tested across many seasons by someone who couldn't afford to get it wrong. Kosher salt at a specific ratio to the weight of each bird, with small additions of black pepper, dried juniper berry, and a quantity of dried wild thyme that Rowan had harvested from the farm's upper pasture herself in August, because that was what the journal specified. Not commercial thyme, but the wild variety that grew on the ridgeline and had a different quality of oil than the cultivated kind. She'd thought, when she first read that instruction, that it was the kind of detail you could probably skip. She'd decided not to skip it, because the whole project was built on the premise that these details mattered, and you couldn't selectively respect the process. The curing took the better part of that evening and most of the following morning. She worked in the lean-to with the lights on, applying the cure by hand to each carcass, massaging it into the cavities and under the skin in the specific way that Ruth's notebooks described. It was slow, repetitive, and required a concentration that was different from the physical concentration of the processing day. Quieter, more careful, more like a conversation you were trying to have correctly. She hung the first birds in the curing house on the afternoon of October 8th. The space was ready. She'd cleaned it thoroughly in September, confirmed the temperature range over multiple weeks of monitoring, checked the wooden rails for structural integrity, and replaced 2 that had developed soft spots. She'd installed a simple digital thermometer and humidity gauge near the entrance so she could monitor conditions without opening the door and disrupting the environment. Everything was as ready as she could make it. When she hung the first bird on the rail and stepped back and looked at it in the dim interior of the stone building, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph. Nothing that uncomplicated. It was more like an awareness of all the time that connected backward from that moment. Elva writing by lamplight, Ruth noting the October smell with that particular exactness, her grandmother reaching to a high closet shelf and handing down a cardboard box on a Sunday evening. The weight of that backward-reaching time sitting in the same room with her, in the smell of stone and salt and old wood. She stood there probably longer than necessary. Then she closed the door carefully, checked the thermometer reading through the exterior monitor, and went to feed the dogs. The waiting period, 4 weeks minimum, up to 7 depending on conditions, was, in some ways, harder than everything that had preceded it. The work didn't stop. There were still 231 birds in the paddocks, requiring daily management, the second processing run to prepare for, equipment repairs, fence maintenance, and all the ordinary accumulation of tasks that a farm at elevation in October generates without pause. But the birds in the curing house were out of her hands now, which meant all she could do was monitor and waiting was not something Rowan was naturally structured for. She checked the thermometer 3 times a day and made herself reduce it to twice a day after the first week, because the checking was becoming compulsive, and Elva had written, in a brisk margin note, she seemed to have added years after the original entry. Do not hover over what is curing. The house knows its work. Trust it and go do something useful. She tried to go do something useful. The second processing run happened in the 3rd week of October, with a slightly smoother operation. The new picker fingers had arrived, the Scalder thermostat had been replaced, and she'd added a 4th person to the line, a woman named Teresa, who was a neighbor from 3 miles down the road and who had appeared at the farm one morning having heard from someone that Rowan was looking for help and having decided, apparently on her own authority, to show up and offer it. Teresa was 44, had grown up in Ash Ridge, had worked on her family's farm until it was sold, and had been working at the hardware store in town for 6 years, and was, by her own direct account, extremely tired of it. I want to learn this, Teresa said simply on that first morning. I'll work for what you can afford right now. What Rowan could afford right now was not much. Teresa had said that was fine. The second run processed 40 birds. Better temperature control, fewer jams, documentation cleaner. They finished before 2 in the afternoon. Teresa cleaned up without being asked to and asked 3 precise, practical questions about the curing process, and Rowan answered them with the journals spread open on the work table. The second group of birds went into the curing house 3 days later. In the first week of November, Rowan emailed Dominique Farrow at the restaurant in Asheville. She'd been composing the email in her head for 3 weeks, which meant she'd written about 12 drafts by the time she actually sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop. All the mental drafts had been too long, too explanatory, too eager to justify and contextualize the entire previous 6 months. The actual email she sent was 4 sentences. She explained that she had a small number of heritage bronze turkeys dry-aged, using traditional curing methods, that she would have finished product available for evaluation in approximately 2 weeks, and that she would be grateful for the opportunity to deliver a sample for Dominique's honest assessment. The reply came the following morning. Send me 2 birds when you're ready. I'll give them my full attention. 2 birds, 2 chances. She wrote it in the notebook and closed it. She opened the curing house for the first serious evaluation on the 14th of November, when the first group had been curing for 5 weeks and 3 days. She'd gone in twice in the interim for brief temperature checks, but this was the first time she opened the door and actually went inside and looked carefully, with a flashlight, at what had been happening in the dark and the cold. The appearance was right. The color development across the skin was what Elva's notes described. A darkening to a deep amber-tinged brown, dry to the touch, but not desiccated, with a surface texture that indicated the curing process had progressed as it should. The smell, when she stood inside and let her senses adjust, was the thing Ruth had spent half a paragraph trying to describe. Rowan stood there and understood why Ruth had thought it needed a paragraph. It was not a simple smell. It was layered in a way that made you aware you were smelling thyme as much as anything else. The juniper and thyme underneath, and above them something deeper and more complex that was the birds themselves transformed by weeks of the curing house doing what it had been built to do. She pulled out her phone and called her grandmother. "Can you come to the curing house?" she said, when Margaret picked up. A pause. "Now?" "Yes." Another pause. "Give me 10 minutes. Margaret came down the hill in her heavy coat and her good boots. She reserved the good boots for things she considered significant. And Rowan opened the curing house door and let her go in first, and stood outside and watched through the open door as her grandmother stood in the interior with the flashlight Rowan had left on a hook just inside. She was in there for a while. Rowan waited. The cold was beginning to settle down from the ridge as the afternoon moved toward evening, and the dogs were doing their perimeter somewhere out in the lower field, their white shapes visible occasionally against the dark grass. When Margaret came out, she wasn't crying. She had the specific composure of someone who considered crying a private matter and was maintaining it actively. But there was something in her face that Rowan would not forget, a fullness, like a room that had been empty for a long time and had something real in it again. "It smells exactly right," her grandmother said. "Yes. It smells like I was a child." She said it plainly, without drama, and looked back at the curing house for a moment. Then she straightened her coat. 2 more weeks on those first birds at least. Don't rush the last part." "I won't. Your great-grandmother never rushed the last part. That was the thing that made it different from everything else." She turned toward the farmhouse. "Come in when you're done. I'm making soup." Rowan selected the 2 birds for Dominique Farrow on the 21st of November. She chose them carefully, not the 2 largest, not the 2 most visually perfect, but the 2 whose condition across every measurement she'd been tracking most completely represented what the process was supposed to produce. She packed them in the clean cooler she'd bought specifically for this purpose, with ice and a note that explained briefly how they'd been raised, how they'd been processed, and how long and by what method they'd been cured. She didn't write much. She'd learned by now that too many words about something was usually a way of being uncertain about it. She drove to Asheville the following morning, 3 hours down the mountain in the truck, the cooler strapped in the bed. She'd been to the restaurant once before in September to see the space without explaining who she was or why she was there. Just a person eating lunch, watching how the food came out of the kitchen, reading the menu language to understand what kind of cooking this was and whether her product had a place in it. It did. She'd been fairly sure of that. The delivery was brief and logistically uncomplicated. She carried the cooler to the kitchen entrance where a prep cook brought Dominique out, a woman in her mid-40s with flour on her forearm and a directness in her manner that Rowan found immediately comfortable. They shook hands. Dominique looked at the birds with the eyes of someone who actually knows how to evaluate a raw product, lifting one slightly, examining the skin, pressing along the breast, bending close to assess the smell. 5 weeks cure, she said. 5.5 on the first, 6 on the second. Heritage bronze? Yes. Forage and pasture? Rotational from July through October. Supplemental grain cut down from standard formula. Dominique straightened up. She hadn't said whether she was impressed, and she didn't say it now. She just said, "I'll have something for you by Friday." Rowan drove back up the mountain. She did not sleep well for the next 3 days. She kept the notebook going, kept the remaining birds in the curing house on their monitoring schedule, helped Teresa with the lower pasture fencing that needed repair before winter set in hard. She cooked a meal for her grandmother on Tuesday night that required more concentration than cooking usually required, because concentration was what she had available and it needed to go somewhere. On Thursday evening, 1 day earlier than expected, her phone rang with an Asheville area code. She was in the barn. She sat down on a hay bale. "Rowan," Dominique said without preamble, "tell me how many birds you have available for Thanksgiving." She closed her eyes, opened them. "I have 107 finished from the first 2 runs, another 60-some in the house that'll be done by the 20th. Can you hold 40 for me?" Her brain did the arithmetic on what Dominique Farrow's name on a purchase would mean, not just financially, not just for this season, but for everything that came after it. "Yes," she said. "I served the breast from one of your birds tonight at a private dinner. 11 guests." A pause, and in that pause Rowan could hear something. Not effusiveness, which wasn't Dominique's register, but something close to controlled urgency. "I had 3 people ask me where it came from before they finished the course. I've been cooking for 20 years. That does not happen with turkey." Rowan sat on the hay bale in the cold barn and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. "I want to talk pricing," Dominique said, "and I want to talk about next year." The pricing conversation with Dominique happened 2 days later over the phone, and it was the most uncomfortable 20 minutes Rowan had experienced since the auction in June, which was saying something because the auction in June had involved 300 sick birds and a room full of people who thought she was making a catastrophic mistake. The discomfort wasn't adversarial. Dominique wasn't trying to lowball her. The discomfort was that Rowan had never negotiated the value of something she'd built herself, and there was a particular vulnerability in that. In saying out loud what you believed your work was worth, and waiting to find out if the other person agreed. She'd done the math the night before, sitting at the kitchen table after her grandmother had gone to bed. Not the rough math she'd been running in her head for months, but the real accounting. What she'd actually spent, what she'd lost, what she still owed on the equipment, what it had cost her in time at a number she was willing to accept as her own labor rate. She'd written the number at the bottom of the page and looked at it for a while. Then she'd written a second number, higher, because the first number was what covered her costs, and the second number was what the product was actually worth. And she'd decided at some point in the previous 6 months that those were different questions and she needed to know the answer to both of them before she got on the phone. "What are you thinking per pound?" Dominique asked. Rowan told her the second number. A pause. Not a long one, 2-3 seconds at most, but the kind of pause that contains a genuine response being formulated rather than a position being performed. "That's above what I'm currently paying for the best pork I source," Dominique said. "I know. You understand why I'm noting that?" "Yes, and I think it's still the right number." She'd rehearsed this part, not the words exactly, but the steadiness. "What you served at that dinner isn't comparable to what you're sourcing elsewhere. If it were comparable, 3 people wouldn't have asked where it came from before they finished the course." Another pause. Then something that was almost a laugh. Brief, genuine. "Fair point," Dominique said. "All right. For this season, your number. For next year, we renegotiate based on volume." "Agreed. I'm also going to want exclusivity within a 50-mile radius of Asheville." That one she hadn't expected. She thought about it for a moment. "For this season, yes. After that, it depends on what my total output looks like." "Reasonable." A beat. "I'm going to tell people where this came from, Rowan. You should know that. I don't source things I'm not willing to put my name behind, and I don't put my name behind things I'm not willing to talk about. This is going to get attention." "Okay," Rowan said, with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "Is okay the right response to that? Or are you just saying okay?" She thought about it honestly. "Both," she said. Dominique said she'd send the formal agreement by email and rang off. Rowan sat at the kitchen table for a moment, phone in her hand, then set it down and looked out the window at the mountain. The morning was gray and cold, with low clouds sitting on the upper ridge, and the farm below it looked the way it always looked from the house, like something that asked a lot of you and gave back in its own time on its own terms. She went to tell her grandmother. Margaret was in the kitchen garden, which she continued to maintain well past the point when most people her age would have handed it off to someone else, cutting back the last of the spent stalks in preparation for winter. She was wearing her heavy coat and a knitted hat pulled low, and she looked up when Rowan came down the path with an expression that already knew something had happened. Rowan told her the number Dominique had agreed to. She told her about the exclusivity arrangement, about what Dominique had said regarding attention. Margaret listened without interrupting. Then she pulled off her gardening glove, one finger at a time, which was something she did when she was absorbing information that mattered and needed her hands free to think. "That's nearly 4 times what your grandfather got for birds at the Shelton plant," she said. "I know. At that price, 40 birds for Thanksgiving is—" She did her own math, which was accurate and fast, because Margaret Mercer had been doing farm math in her head since she was 12 years old. She said the figure out loud and then looked at Rowan with an expression that was complicated in the specific way of someone who is proud and relieved and a little undone by both feelings simultaneously. "That covers the equipment," Rowan said. "Most of the feed costs for the season, and some of what I came back here with." Margaret looked at the garden for a moment. Then she said, quietly and without dramatizing it, "Your great-grandmother would have liked you very much." Rowan didn't answer that. She picked up the second pair of loppers leaning against the fence and started working on the row next to her grandmother's, and they worked together in the cold without talking for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. The deliveries to Dominique happened in 2 runs. The first on November 19th, with 22 birds from the initial cure group, and the second on the 23rd, 3 days before Thanksgiving, with the remaining 18 from the second run. Rowan drove each delivery herself, the coolers strapped in the truck bed, the access road still navigable, though the first serious snowfall of the season had come in on the 15th and left 4 inches that had since mostly compacted to ice on the lower switchbacks. The second delivery was the one where things started to become real in a way that was harder to manage internally. When she pulled up to the kitchen entrance of the restaurant, there was a different quality to the reception. Dominique came out herself, which she hadn't done the first time, and behind her was a young man with a phone who asked if he could take a photograph of the coolers being unloaded. Dominique caught Rowan's expression and waved him back. "Later," she said to him and to Rowan. "A writer. He's doing a piece on local sourcing for one of the Asheville food publications. I told him about the farm. He'd like to come up and see it." "After the season," Rowan said. "Not right now." Dominique nodded like that was the answer she'd expected. "Smart." She signed the delivery paperwork and looked at it for a moment before handing the copy back. "I had someone call me yesterday, a chef in Knoxville who heard from someone I'd mentioned the birds to at a dinner 2 weeks ago. He wants to know if you have anything available." "Not this season." I told him that. He asked about next year. She handed Dominique the paperwork copy and picked up the empty cooler from the first run, which Dominique's staff had cleaned and set aside. "Tell him to email me in January," she said. She drove back up the mountain through the cold with the radio off, thinking about next year, about how many birds, about the curing house capacity, which was a real limitation she'd been thinking about since October, about Teresa, who had shown up every week since her first day without being asked and had learned the curing documentation so thoroughly that she could run it herself now, about what it would take to expand the facility without compromising the specific conditions that made it work. The thinking had a different quality now than it had had in June. In June, it had been theoretical, elaborate, hopeful, and slightly desperate. Now it had the weight of something demonstrated. She knew what the birds could do. She knew the curing house worked. She knew there was a market. The question had shifted from whether to how much and how fast, and the answer to that question, she'd decided, was going to be slower than the market probably wanted and faster than she'd be comfortable with. And somewhere in that tension, she'd have to find the pace she could sustain. She got home at 4 in the afternoon. Teresa's truck was in the yard, which meant she'd come up to do the evening feed without being scheduled to, which was the kind of thing Teresa did that made Rowan increasingly grateful and slightly guilty about how little she could currently afford to pay her. Carl Weems' truck was also in the yard, which was something else entirely. She sat in the truck for a moment looking at it. Then she got out. Carl was standing near the barn, not inside it, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the posture of a man who has come somewhere with a purpose, but has been waiting long enough that the purpose has begun to feel slightly less certain. He was a big man, Carl, not as broad as Dale Pritchard, but taller, with a face that defaulted to authority and was currently doing something more uncomfortable than that. "Carl," she said. "Rowan." He looked at the barn, at the curing house up on the hill, at her face. "You weren't here." "I had deliveries." She waited. He pulled one hand out of his pocket and rubbed it across the back of his neck, which she recognized as a man preparing to say something he'd rather not say. "I heard about the Faro contract," he said. "Okay." "I heard the number." In a county this size, information moved the way water moved in terrain, along whatever channels existed, finding the low places, filling them. She wasn't surprised. "Okay," she said again. "That's a real number, Set," he said. "For turkey." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved slightly, the way it does when someone is organizing language that isn't coming naturally. "I said some things at the extension meeting," he finally said, "in September. About your operation. About the likelihood of it working. I heard. Dale gave me an earful about it after." He looked at the ground briefly. He was right to. What I said was... He stopped. It wasn't charitable, and it wasn't accurate. I was speaking from what I knew, which turned out to be less than I thought. He said that last part like it cost him something, which it probably did. She looked at him. Carl Weems was 61 years old, had run a 1,000-bird conventional operation for 30 years, and had never, as far as she knew, been wrong about anything in his own estimation. The man in front of her right now was not comfortable, and he wasn't pretending to be. And that meant the discomfort was real, which made it matter. "I appreciate you coming up here to say that," she said. He nodded once. Then he looked toward the curing house again. "The stone building up there. That's where you're doing the aging?" "Yes." "Old construction?" "Pre-war. My great-great-grandfather built it." He was quiet again for a moment, looking up the hill, and she could see him recalibrating something. Not just his opinion of her, but something more foundational, about what was possible with what was already on the land, what had been forgotten that still had value. She recognized the look because she'd had a version of it herself, standing in the curing house in May with a flashlight and a tin box of journals. "I've got 60 acres on the south side of my property I've been trying to figure out what to do with," he said. "Doesn't suit the conventional operation. Too rough, too much slope." He said it carefully, the way someone introduces an idea they haven't finished yet. "I'm not suggesting anything specific. I'm just saying, if you ever need land for expansion, there might be a conversation worth having." She held that for a moment. "January," she said. "Come talk to me in January. I'll know better than what next year looks like." He nodded, said his goodbye, and drove back down the mountain. She stood in the yard after his taillights disappeared around the first switchback. The cold was settling in with the evening. The dogs were coming in from the far paddock, and Teresa appeared at the barn door and looked at her with an expression of mild inquiry. "Was that Carl Weems?" Teresa said. "Yes." "What did he want?" "To apologize, mostly, and to offer me land." Teresa considered this. "People are funny about being wrong," she said. "They really are." "Are you going to take the land?" "I don't know yet. Maybe." She moved toward the barn. "Feed's done?" "Done and documented." Teresa held up the notebook. "I also fixed the latch on the south paddock gate. It's been loose for 2 weeks." "I know. I kept forgetting." "I noticed." Teresa handed back the notebook and picked up her jacket from the fence post. "You heard from anyone else about buying birds?" "I ran into a woman at the hardware store who said her sister's husband heard you were selling and wanted to know if there were any left." "Not for this season. All 40 for Dominique, and I've got 16 already spoken for through private customers." She'd gotten 3 emails in the past week from people she didn't know, contacts of contacts, the way things traveled, asking about availability. She'd replied to all of them the same way. "This season is closed. I'll have a wait list for next year. Email me in January." "You should probably build the wait list now," Teresa said. "I'm building it." Teresa nodded, pulled on her jacket. "See you Thursday," she said, and drove down the mountain. The Thanksgiving deliveries to the private customers happened over 2 days, November 24th and 25th. And Rowan handled them herself with the smaller cooler, driving the county roads with a handwritten list on the seat beside her. The customers were a mix. A retired couple outside Black Mountain who'd heard about the farm from Dominique's restaurant. A woman in Weaverville who ran a small catering operation. A family in Swannanoa who had called 3 times to ask questions before ordering, which she'd found mildly exhausting and ultimately endearing. Each delivery was brief and practical. She didn't linger, didn't seek praise, didn't present herself as anything other than the person delivering what had been ordered. The catering woman, whose name was Louise, looked at the bird when Rowan uncrated it on her kitchen counter and said, "I heard about these from Dominique. She said they were something special." She examined it with the careful attention of a professional. "She doesn't say that often." "I know," Rowan said. Louise looked up at her. "How many can I get next year?" "Email me in January," she said, and drove to the next delivery. She got back to the farm on the evening of the 25th with an empty cooler and a bank account that had a number in it she hadn't seen since before she'd come back to Ash Ridge. She sat in the truck in the dark yard for a moment, not doing anything, just sitting. The mountain was dark above her, the farmhouse lit in the kitchen window where her grandmother would be. And somewhere up the slope, the curing house was empty now for the first time since October. Just stone and old wood and the particular quiet of a space that had done its work. She was not done. The 60-some birds still in the house from the 3rd and 4th processing runs, smaller batch, done in early November, were cured to a shorter period and would be ready in December, most of them already spoken for. The equipment needed winterizing. The pastures needed rest and planning. The waitlist was accumulating names. The journalist from the Asheville food publication had sent an email she hadn't answered yet. Dale Pritchard came by on the afternoon of the 26th, which she'd half expected. He came with a bag of apples from his tree for her grandmother, which was his standard social currency, and she met him in the yard and they stood in the cold, which was how most conversations on Mercer Ridge happened, and he looked at the farm the way he'd been looking at it since September, with a recalibration that had been ongoing and was still ongoing. "Carl called me," he said. "I figured." Said he came up to apologize. He did. Dale shifted his weight. "Carl doesn't apologize to people very often." I got that impression. "He means it when he does." He looked at the curing house up on the hill. "He told me about the land offer, too." She watched him. "Does that bother you?" He seemed genuinely surprised by the question. "No, why would it?" He looked at her with the straight-line honesty that had always been his most consistent quality, even when she'd found it infuriating. "I was wrong about you in June. Carl was wrong about you in September. We're both going to have to live with that." He said it flatly, without self-flagellation. "But that's not the same as being wrong forever." She thought about Elva writing in the drought year of 1936. She thought about her grandmother's face in the curing house doorway. That fullness, like a room reclaimed. "No," she said. "It's not." Dale pulled the apple bag from under his arm and held it out. "These are for your grandmother." She took them. "You want coffee?" He hesitated exactly 1 second, which was the Dale Pritchard version of being pleased about something. "Sure," he said. They went inside, and her grandmother looked up from the kitchen table where she was reading and looked at Dale with a complicated warmth that had the depth of 30 years of knowing someone in it. And Dale stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and said, "Evening, Mag." And she said, "Dale, sit down." And he sat down, and Rowan made coffee for 3 people in the kitchen that her great-great-grandmother had cooked in, and the mountain held everything in its cold and its dark outside the windows, and none of it was simple, and most of it was enough. December came in hard that year, the kind of hard that settles into the bones of a mountain farm and stays there. Frozen water lines at 4 in the morning, road ice that made the lower switchbacks genuinely treacherous, a cold that arrived before sunset and didn't release until well after 9 the following morning. Rowan had winterized what she could in November, but there were always things you didn't get to in time, and the first week of December found her with a heat lamp failure in the remaining shelter area, a section of perimeter fence that the ice had pulled loose from its posts, and a truck that wouldn't start on Wednesday morning until she'd spent 40 minutes with a battery charger and a considerable amount of patience she didn't naturally have at 6 a.m. None of it was catastrophic. That was the thing she'd learned about farming at elevation. The problems were constant, but they were mostly manageable if you caught them early and didn't panic. And panicking had never been a strong tendency in her anyway. She fixed what needed fixing, noted what could wait, and kept moving through the days with the particular forward-leaning momentum of someone who has a lot left to do before winter fully closes in. The last birds from the curing house came out in the third week of December. The smaller batch from the third and fourth processing runs finished to 5 weeks rather than 6, given their lower starting weight. She and Teresa did the final documentation together, Teresa running the weight measurements, while Rowan checked condition and made the quality calls. They'd developed a working shorthand by now, the kind that comes from doing the same detailed work alongside someone long enough that you stop explaining every step and just do it. Rowan appreciated that quality in a person, the willingness to learn something thoroughly enough that it becomes its own kind of fluency. 11 of those final birds went to the private waitlist customers. 4 went to a chef in Knoxville named Marcus Webb, who had been the one Dominique had mentioned back in November, and who had sent Rowan an email in early December that was courteous and specific and asked better questions than most people asked. She'd called him instead of emailing back, because the questions warranted a real conversation, and they'd talked for 40 minutes about heritage breeds and curing methods, and what the market for this kind of product looked like from a chef's side of the table. "Dominique told me you were worth calling," he'd said at one point. She said that? She said, and I'm quoting directly here, "She doesn't oversell and she doesn't underdeliver, which makes her unusual enough to be worth your time." A pause. From Dominique, that's about as strong an endorsement as you're going to get. She'd sent him 4 birds at the Asheville price. He'd called after he'd had a chance to work with them and said 3 sentences: that they were the best turkey he'd cooked in his career, that he wanted to be on the list for next year, and that he'd be telling people about the farm. Then he'd said goodbye and hung up, which she'd found deeply satisfying. A man who used exactly as many words as the situation required. The journalist from the Asheville food publication, his name was Theo, he was 31, and earnest in the specific way of someone who genuinely loved food writing and hadn't yet had it beaten out of him, finally came up the mountain on the 14th of December, after she'd agreed to a visit with the explicit understanding that the piece wouldn't run until after the season was fully closed, and she'd had time to review the farm-related details for accuracy. He'd spent 3 hours on the farm. He'd walked the paddocks, seen the curing house, sat at the kitchen table with Rowan, while her grandmother moved quietly in the background and occasionally contributed a sentence or two that Theo quickly learned to write down verbatim, because they were more useful than anything he'd get from asking a formal question. At one point he'd asked Rowan, "What do you want people to understand about what you're doing here?" She'd thought about it for a moment. "I'm not doing anything new," she said. "That's the thing people keep getting wrong when they talk about it. I'm doing something old. The new part is just that I'm stubborn enough to think old things still work." He'd written that down too. The piece ran in January. It was good, careful, accurate, not oversold. He described the farm the way it actually was, which was imperfect and cold and located on a road that was hard on vehicles, and he described the product the way it actually was, which was exceptional and available in limited quantities and not going to be easier to obtain just because you wanted it very much. The photograph he'd run was one of the curing house interior, shot through the open door. The rails, the stone walls, the particular quality of the light inside. Rowan had approved that choice because it was honest. The thing that made the product what it wasn't her face. It was that building and the knowledge inside it and the accumulated time of people who'd come before her. The email volume after the piece ran was significant enough that she had to set up a separate folder and a template response, which she felt slightly awkward about, but also recognized as necessary. The template said plainly that the 2024 season was closed, that she was building a waitlist for the following year, that she was not accepting more than a certain number of orders per customer, regardless of willingness to pay, and that she appreciated the interest. She sent it without apology, because apologizing for having a limited supply of something you'd worked that hard to produce seemed like the wrong instinct. What she hadn't anticipated was the call from the county extension office. It came in the second week of January. Not from Patrick, but from his supervisor, a woman named Dr. Elaine Marsh, who ran the agricultural development program for the county, and who had apparently been following the situation since Patrick's initial visit in August with the clipboard and the careful questions. "I'd like to come see the operation," Dr. Marsh said on the phone. "For what purpose?" "Documentation, possibly case study development. We're working on a regional heritage agriculture initiative, trying to identify models that might inform policy recommendations and potentially some grant structures for other small producers who want to move in this direction." A pause. "Your operation is, frankly, the most compelling thing that's happened in this county's agricultural picture in about 15 years. Rowan said she was welcome to come. She came the following Thursday with Patrick, who greeted Rowan with the slightly sheepish warmth of someone who knows their early clipboard visit is now part of a larger story, and a colleague who did economic analysis. They spent most of the day on the farm. They asked good questions and wrote things down and were honest about what they didn't understand, which Rowan appreciated. What came out of that visit over the following months was a formal case study that the Extension Office published in the spring and a conversation about a pilot grant program for heritage agriculture practices that would still be working its way through the relevant bureaucracy a year later, which was how these things always went, and which Rowan had no particular illusions about speeding up. What mattered was that the conversation had started. Someone with institutional authority was now saying out loud that what she'd done was worth replicating, which meant that the next person who wanted to try something like it in this county would have slightly more support and slightly less ridicule to navigate. That mattered, not for her. She was past the point where outside validation changed her daily decisions. But it mattered for whoever came next. Margaret's health began to change in February. It wasn't sudden. It was the kind of change that happens in increments small enough that you keep telling yourself each individual one is manageable, and then one morning you look at the accumulation of them and understand what they mean. She was slower on the stairs. She tired earlier in the evenings. She had a stretch of 3 weeks in February when a respiratory illness that would have been ordinary in someone younger took a hold that was harder to shake than it should have been. Rowan had her in to see the doctor twice in February and once in March. The doctor was a practical woman named Hargrove who spoke plainly, which Rowan was grateful for. Margaret's heart was doing something it shouldn't be doing with a consistency that had crossed from occasional concern into ongoing management. The respiratory illness had resolved, but it had left a residue of fatigue that didn't fully clear. She was 79 in March, and 79 on a mountain farm in winter asks more than 79 in a warmer place with flatter ground. Margaret herself was characteristically undramatic about it. "I'm old," she said to Rowan one evening in the kitchen, with the directness of someone stating a fact about the weather. "I've been old for a while. What's changed is I'm getting older faster." "That's not a very specific medical assessment," Rowan said. "No, but it's accurate." She looked at her coffee cup. "I want to talk to you about the farm." They talked about it over several evenings that stretched from late February into March. Not a single large conversation, but a series of smaller ones that together covered the property, the deed, the small amount of existing debt, the maintenance obligations, the specific legal questions that required an attorney named Grover who had handled the Mercer family's paperwork for 20 years, and who came up the mountain one afternoon in March with a briefcase and a patient demeanor and sat with them both at the kitchen table for 2 hours. What it came to, in practical terms, was this. Rowan was already the farm. She'd been the farm since April of the previous year, in every way that mattered operationally. What the paperwork did was make it formal. Her name on the deed alongside her grandmother's, the succession clear, the inheritance arranged in a way that avoided the particular legal complications that had broken up other family farms in the county when the time came. After Grover left, Margaret sat in her chair by the window for a while, looking at the pastures. "Your grandfather always meant to do that sooner," she said. "The formal arrangement. He kept putting it off. He thought there was more time." She didn't say it with bitterness, just with the particular tiredness of someone who has carried a thing for a long time. "There's never as much time as you think there is." "No," Rowan said. There isn't. You're going to do well with it. She said it as a statement, not encouragement, an assessment. You're not reckless. You look like you're reckless, buying 300 sick birds with your last money, but you're not. You do the math. You read the instructions. A small pause. You trust the old things. I learned that from you, from Elva, from Ruth, from all of us. She looked at Rowan with the directness that had always been her defining quality. Don't let it get too big too fast. Whatever it becomes, the thing that makes it work is the care, and you can only bring so much care to so much at once. Remember that. Rowan remembered it. Spring came, and with it the planning for the second season, which was both more and less complicated than the first had been. More because the scale was larger. She'd committed to 220 birds for the season, which was nearly double the previous year's surviving flock. And the logistics of that expansion required equipment she didn't have, infrastructure she hadn't built yet, and a level of coordination with Teresa and 2 additional part-time helpers she'd brought on in March that was new territory for her as a manager of people rather than just a manager of birds and processes. She was not naturally a delegator. She had to work at it deliberately, had to practice the specific discipline of explaining something thoroughly once and then stepping back and letting someone else do it, even when the urge to just do it herself was very loud. The less complicated part was that she knew now what she was doing. Not everything. There would always be a drought year, a predator problem, a processing day that went sideways. But the fundamental process, the rotational grazing, the specific feed formula Gerald Foss had refined with her over the winter, the curing schedule, the market relationships, all of that had been tested and she knew what it produced. The uncertainty of the previous year had been replaced by a different kind of uncertainty, which was the uncertainty of a larger operation, and that was better in every way that mattered. She'd taken Carl Weems up on the land offer. Not all 60 acres, 30 of them, on a lease arrangement that Patrick had helped her structure in a way that gave her use rights without the capital obligation of purchase. It gave her the additional paddock space she needed for the expanded flock and a south-facing hillside that she had plans for longer term, plans that involved a second curing structure that she was thinking about the way Elva had probably thought about the original one, carefully, precisely, with the understanding that the building was part of the product, not just the housing for it. Carl had come up to sign the lease agreement in February, on a cold afternoon when the ground was still hard. He'd looked at the farm with the evaluating eye of a man who understood land, and she'd watched him see it the way she saw it, not what it had been when she arrived, which had been reduced and overgrown and carrying the exhausted quality of something that had been managed down to its minimum, but what it was becoming. "You're going to need more help than you think," he said. "I know. I know a family over near Ridgecrest. The Callaway kids, they're in their 20s, grew up farming, looking for something serious to work on. If you want, I'll introduce you." She'd met the Callaway family in March. 2 brothers, James and Seth, 24 and 27, who had the particular quality of young men who had been around animals their whole lives and understood instinctively the difference between the work being done to the animals and the work being done with them. She'd hired them both part-time for the season, with the honest statement that she couldn't promise what the following year would look like, but that if the operation grew the way she thought it would grow, there would be more work available. Seth had asked, during that first meeting, what it was she was actually trying to build. She'd thought about it. "A farm that's worth something in 100 years, she said. Not worth a lot of money necessarily, worth something. Like the kind of worth where the person running it in 100 years finds a tin box in a building and reads the notebooks inside and understands what they're standing inside." Seth had looked at her for a moment. Then he'd nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've received information that reorganizes something. "Okay," he said. "I can work with that." Margaret died on the 14th of April, not unexpectedly, not suddenly. She had been declining through March in the way that Dr. Hargrove had prepared them for, gradually and then less gradually, with periods of clarity and presence interspersed with the increasing heaviness of a body winding down. Rowan had slept in the farmhouse every night through that month, had arranged for a home health aide named Carol to come 3 days a week, had sat with her grandmother through the evenings when Margaret was awake, and sometimes through the nights when she wasn't, doing the things you do when someone is leaving, holding a hand, reading aloud from the books she liked, making sure she had what she needed, which was less than you'd think. She was conscious on the morning of the 14th, which was a warm morning, unusual for April at that elevation. Rowan had opened the bedroom window because Margaret had asked for air, and the window looked toward the north side of the property where the curing house sat under the white oaks. The sound of the farm came through the window. Birds in the distance, the dogs somewhere below, the wind through the trees. "You hear them?" her grandmother said. "Yes." "They sound right." She meant the birds. She'd been listening to the birds on that farm for 60 years. She knew what right sounded like. "They're good," Rowan said. "The flock is good this year." Margaret's hand was in hers. It was lighter than it used to be, the way old hands get lighter. Not frail exactly, but reduced to their essentials. "The curing house," she said. "Still working." A small sound that was almost a laugh. "Of course it is." She closed her eyes. "Don't change the door, the old hardware, don't change it." "I won't." She died that afternoon, quietly, with Rowan sitting beside her and the window open and the farm outside doing what it had always done. The grief was not simple, and it was not brief. Rowan had known it wouldn't be. She didn't make the mistake of thinking she could manage through it on efficiency alone. She let it be what it was, which was large and complicated and mixed with everything else, the way real grief always is. There were days in April when she cried in the barn, which was private and had good acoustics for it. There were days when she was too tired to cry and just moved through the work with the numb forward momentum of someone who doesn't know what else to do, which was sometimes its own kind of mercy. Teresa understood without being told when to give her space and when to be present, which was the most practical kind of kindness. Dale Pritchard came up the mountain the day after Margaret died and stayed for an hour, and didn't say much, just sat in the kitchen with his coffee and looked at the room the way you look at a place when someone is gone from it. When he left, he stopped at the door and said, "She was a remarkable woman, the ornery kind of remarkable, which is the best kind." He put on his hat and went down the mountain. The season moved forward, the flock grew, the work required what it required. By September, the farm looked different from what it had looked like a year before. More organized, more deliberately laid out, the paddocks running in the rotation she'd refined over 2 seasons. The new shelter structures better built than the first ones. The processing facility expanded with a walk-in cooler she'd installed in June. There were 4 people working on Mercer Ridge now besides herself, and the coordination of that was its own ongoing challenge that she was still learning how to manage without micromanaging, which was a distinction she had to remind herself of approximately once a day. The waitlist for the second season had been closed since February. There were names on it she'd had to turn away, which was one of the stranger feelings she'd experienced, turning away money, turning away people who wanted the thing she'd built. She'd done it without apology and with a clarity that came from her grandmother's instruction in March. You can only bring so much care to so much at once. She held that line. It cost her in the short term. It was the right decision. Dominique called in September with a request to expand the Thanksgiving order by 20 birds. Rowan told her she could do 12. Dominique said that worked and then said, as an aside, that she'd had a conversation with a food editor in New York who was interested in the farm for a larger feature. "What kind of larger?" Rowan said. "National publication, significant readership." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you think I should do?" Dominique, who had been in the food world long enough to have opinions about this, said, "I think you should decide how much of your life you want to spend answering questions and how much you want to spend farming. Those are not always the same amount." "Noted. I'll tell them to reach out and you can make the call." The editor reached out. Rowan thought about it for a week, not agonizing over it, but genuinely thinking it through the way she thought through everything consequential, which was slowly and with a notebook open. She thought about what the attention would bring, which was both opportunity and noise, and she thought about what it would cost, which was time and privacy and a certain kind of quiet that she'd come to depend on. She did the interview. She kept it short. She said what was true and declined to say what wasn't. And when the writer tried to make the story into something more dramatic than it was, tried to sand it into the kind of clean narrative that reads well and loses the actual texture of what happened, she corrected it. politely and without flexibility. The piece ran in November. It described the farm accurately. It brought more email than she had time to answer and more attention than she was comfortable with. And it also brought 2 serious inquiries from other small farmers in the region who wanted to know if she would be willing to talk about heritage breeds and on-farm processing, which she did, because those conversations seemed to her worth the time in a way that most of the attention wasn't. One of those farmers was a woman named Harriet, 48 years old, who had 3 acres of rough land in the next county, and a set of questions that were good enough that Rowan invited her up to the farm to ask them in person. Harriet came in December, walked the operation, asked her questions, and stood in the curing house for a long time without saying anything. "I have an old smokehouse on my property," Harriet finally said. "Been empty for 30 years. I always thought it was too far gone." "You should have it looked at," Rowan said. "The old buildings are usually more intact than they look." Harriet looked at the walls, the rails, the accumulated darkness of a century of use. "How do you know when the conditions are right? You measure, you monitor, and then you trust it." She looked at the stone. "These walls have been doing this for 100 years. They know more than I do. My job is just not to get in the way." Harriet nodded. She'd come back in January with more questions, which Rowan answered, and the following spring she'd started her own small operation. It would be slow, and it would be hard, and some seasons it would not go the way she planned. Rowan told her that plainly. Harriet said she understood. She probably did, in the way you can understand something before it happens. You understand it differently after. On a morning in late October of that second year, after the flock was well established in its rotation, after the curing house was full again, and the season was running the way it needed to run, Rowan sat on the slope above the north paddock with her back against one of the white oaks that shaded the curing house. The dogs were visible in the lower field. The birds were moving through the morning with their unhurried, purposeful quality, heads down, working the ground the way they'd been selected across generations to work it. She had the notebook with her. She'd been adding to it all year, not just records, but observations, the kind of notes that were addressed to no one in particular but might be found useful by whoever came after. She tried to write them the way Elva had written them, precisely, honestly, without dramatizing either the successes or the failures. She wrote, on that October morning, "Second season, week 41. Flock at full rotation, condition good. Curing house is active, condition stable. The 2 Calloway brothers are reliable and learning fast. Teresa could run this operation without me for a week, which means I've done at least one thing right. Still losing sleep on processing days. Probably always will. The fence on the east perimeter needs attention before the first hard freeze." She paused, looked at the field, at the birds, at the mountain above her that held its position the way mountains do, without regard for anything that happened at its feet, which was not indifference but something better than indifference, something more like context. She wrote, "A woman from the next county came in December with an empty smokehouse. She's starting her own operation this spring. I gave her what I had to give, which is mostly what Elva and Ruth gave me. The process, the patience, the understanding that the old things work if you take them seriously." She stopped writing, closed the notebook. The thing about a farm at elevation is that it never lets you believe you've arrived. There's always a problem ahead, always a season that won't go the way you need it to, always something that needs attention before you've finished attending to the last thing. It asks you to give up the idea of finished, which most people find uncomfortable, and which Rowan had found, somewhere in the past 2 years, to be the thing she was most grateful for. Because finished is a story you tell yourself when you're afraid. Ongoing is the real condition of anything worth doing. She'd bought 300 sick birds on her last money, in a summer that everyone said was the wrong season, in a county that had already decided she was going to fail. She hadn't done it because she was fearless. She'd done it because she had a tin box full of notebooks and an old stone building and the specific stubbornness of someone who has looked at the thing that everyone else has written off and understood, in her gut, that they were looking at the wrong thing the wrong way. That wasn't genius. It wasn't vision, the way people would start calling it after the articles ran and the wait list got long, and the story became something that people liked to tell. It was reading. It was listening. It was the willingness to trust a dead woman's handwriting over the living opinions of people who had stopped asking questions. Elva had written in the first of the 4 journals before any of the technical material began, on the inside front cover, as though she'd put it there to be read first and last. Every piece of knowledge you need already exists somewhere. Your work is to find it and take it seriously. Rowan had written the same line, word for word, on the inside front cover of her own notebook. She would write it on the inside front cover of every notebook that followed. She stood up from the slope, brushed the grass from her jeans, and went back down to the farm. The dogs came in from the field to meet her at the gate, their big white heads at her hip, their whole demeanor communicating what they always communicated: that they were on the job, that the perimeter was intact, that everything that needed watching was being watched. She scratched behind one set of ears and then the other. She unlatched the gate. She went inside. There was a fence to check on the east perimeter, and the morning was already moving, and the farm was not going to wait.